Danica Nolan's day was already spiraling when she pressed the glowing button for the top floor of the Westbrook Tower and muttered, "Penthouse B. Please don't be one of those guys who tips with leftover Halloween candy." Her arms ached under the weight of the 4 stacked brown bags she was balancing. Rain had soaked through her hoodie, and her sneakers squelched with every step. This was supposed to be her last delivery of the night. And then sweatpants, ramen, and Netflix. She reached the top floor and paused outside the sleek black door marked PH. She double-checked the receipt, then gave the doorbell a tired jab. The door swung open, and standing there, barefoot in black slacks and a crisp white dress shirt, was the most unfairly attractive man she'd ever seen. His hair was damp, like he'd just come from a shower, and his sharp jawline looked like it had been drawn with purpose. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong forearms, and his eyes icy blue and piercing narrowed slightly as they landed on her. "Hi," Danica said, blinking. "Delivery for—" She glanced down. "Mr. Hemsworth?" The man raised an eyebrow. "That's not me." Danica froze. "Wait, isn't this Penthouse B?" "It's Penthouse A." Her heart sank. "You're kidding." He leaned casually against the frame. "Does it look like I'm kidding?" Danica shifted the bags in her arms and gave a groan. "I swear the security guy said B. You'd think with all the money in this place, they'd at least label the doors properly." He let out a soft laugh that caught her off guard. "Come in. You look like you're about to drop those." She hesitated. "I really shouldn't. I'm not going to murder you. I don't even have shoes on." Danica stepped inside, partly because her arms were about to give out and partly because something in his voice, low, smooth, and a little amused, made her feel oddly safe. The penthouse was insane. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering Manhattan skyline. A glass staircase spiraled up to a second level. Everything smelled like cedar and cologne and wealth. He pointed to the marble countertop. "You can set them there." She unloaded the bags with a heavy sigh, brushing damp hair from her face. "Sorry for the mix-up. I'll head next door." "Wait," he said, "what's your name?" She turned, a little thrown. "Danica Nolan. I'm Dorian Decker." She blinked. "Like, the guy who owns Decker Tech." His grin was slow. "Guilty." Danica stared. "You're that Dorian Decker? The tech guy who bought out half of Silicon Alley last year?" He nodded, clearly amused by her expression. "Wow," she muttered. "Guess I should have guessed from the penthouse and the everything." He tilted his head. "And what do you do, Danica Nolan?" "I deliver overpriced noodles to people richer than me," she said dryly, already heading for the door. "Speaking of which, I should go before Mr. Hemsworth starts yelling." "You're funny," he said, following her to the door. "Come back sometime." "For more mistaken deliveries?" she asked. He held her gaze. "For anything." Her heart stuttered. "You don't even know me." "I'd like to." She opened the door, her pulse unsteady. "Good night, Mr. Decker. It's Dorian." "Sure, Dorian," she said, stepping out into the hall. As the door clicked shut behind her, she didn't notice the smile that lingered on his face or the way he stood there for a full minute, staring at the door like something in his life had just shifted. Danica didn't expect to see him again. She figured it was just one of those weird, flirty moments that happened in the city sometimes. A rich guy having a laugh. Nothing more. But 3 days later, when she stopped by her usual bodega for coffee before her shift, he was there, in a tailored navy coat, holding 2 cups. "Thought you might need caffeine," he said like it was the most normal thing in the world. She narrowed her eyes. "How did you know I come here?" "I asked the front desk." "You're kind of unforgettable." Danica blinked. "That's borderline stalker." He shrugged. "I prefer persistent." She took the cup, have to keep her hands busy. "So, what, you're just gonna randomly show up now? Only if you let me buy you dinner." She snorted. "I'm not really the fancy dinner type." "I wasn't planning on fancy," he said. "I was planning on pizza. My place." "You pick the toppings?" Danica stared at him. "You're serious?" "I haven't stopped thinking about you since you rang the wrong door." She should have said no. She had work. Her life was messy. He was a billionaire, for crying out loud. But the way he was looking at her like she was a puzzle he wanted to solve, like she mattered before he even knew her, made it hard to walk away. So instead she said, "Fine. But I swear, if you try to feed me caviar on a cracker, I'm leaving." "Deal." That night, she stood in front of Penthouse A again. Dry this time. Hair done. Wearing a slightly too nice dress she'd borrowed from her roommate. She rang the bell. Dorian opened the door and froze. You look. Wow. Danica rolled her eyes. Just open the pizza. The night was easy. They talked for hours. About everything. She told him about growing up in Jersey, about working 2 jobs to help her mom. He told her about building his company from a college dorm room. I like that you didn't Google me, he said. I did, she admitted. After the bodega thing. You're richer than God. He grinned. That's not why I asked you out. I know, she said, quieter this time. That's the weird part. At some point, she found herself curled up on his sofa, his arm resting behind her. She could feel the heat of him, the way his eyes kept landing on her lips like he was fighting the urge to kiss her. She leaned in first. Just enough. And he met her there. It wasn't a rushed kiss. It was slow. Like he was memorizing the way her mouth fit against his. Like he'd been imagining it since the moment she stepped into his penthouse with those bags in her arms. When they pulled back, he didn't say anything. He just smiled. And for the first time in a long time, Danica felt like maybe, just maybe, she had stepped into something real. Danica glanced at the sleek elevator panel as the numbers lit up one by one, ascending into the clouds. She adjusted the simple leather crossbody slung over her shoulder and tried not to fidget with the edge of her denim jacket. This wasn't a date. Not really. It had only been 3 days since that pizza night, and she wasn't even sure what they were. But Dorian had asked her to come by again tonight. No pressure, no expectations, just, I want to see you. She wasn't used to that. Wanting, she understood. Needing even. But being wanted for nothing more than herself? That was new. When the elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse, Dorian was already there, barefoot again, black t-shirt hugging his shoulders, holding a sketch pad. You draw? She asked, stepping in. He closed the pad slowly. Sometimes. Helps me think. What do you draw? Circuit boards and stock options? He chuckled but didn't answer. Come out to the terrace. It's clearer tonight. She followed him through the open living area and out onto a sweeping wraparound terrace. The city below sparkled like a sea of stars. A soft breeze lifted her hair, and she leaned against the railing. So, he said, standing next to her. I took the afternoon off. She glanced sideways. And did what? Buy another company. I went to my parents' place in Greenwich. That surprised her. Didn't peg you for the family type. I'm not, usually. He rubbed the back of his neck. But I hadn't seen them in a while. Figured it was time. She waited, sensing there was more. My father's not well, he said after a long pause. Parkinson's. It's progressing faster than they expected. Danica's heart tightened. I'm sorry. Thanks. He looked out at the skyline. He was a mechanical engineer. Taught me everything I know about how things work, machines, people, systems. But I've been so caught up in meetings and expansions and all this noise, I didn't notice how fast he was fading. He turned toward her. Being with you made me realize how much time I've been wasting. She didn't know what to say. The vulnerability in his voice was unfamiliar, raw. It made her want to reach out and hold him, even if she barely knew how. Instead, she said, So, what did you draw? He handed her the pad without a word. She flipped it open and blinked. It was a sketch of her, sitting on his couch, hair a little wild, chin resting on her hand, eyes half laughing. The detail was staggering. I didn't know you were watching me, she said softly. I was trying to memorize you. Her throat tightened. I know this is fast, he said, stepping closer. But I can't pretend I don't feel it. Danica looked up. Feel what? Like I've been walking through my life half asleep and then you showed up with soggy sneakers and changed everything. She laughed, partly because it was the only way to keep from melting. I want to know everything, he said. Your favorite song. The worst thing you ever lied about. What scares you? She hesitated, then said, I hate elevators. I take the stairs when I can, even if it's 20 floors. I'm terrified of being stuck. Dorian nodded. What else? I once told my mom I got a full scholarship to calm her down. I didn't. I got 2 jobs instead. He didn't flinch. What's your favorite song? Vienna. Billy Joel. A smile tugged at his mouth. Fitting. She tilted her head. Why? Because that song's about slowing down. Letting life come to you. Danica felt her chest tighten again, but in a different way, like something was breaking open inside her. "You're dangerous," she whispered. He stepped in until there was barely any space between them. "Only if you run." She didn't. Later, they sat on the floor inside, backs against the windows, sharing a bottle of wine from a vineyard he'd visited in Tuscany. "Tell me something no one else knows about you," she said, swirling her glass. "I have nightmares," he said. "About losing control. Not just of the company of everything. I wake up panicked that I've missed something, that something's slipping through my fingers." She didn't ask why. She just reached over and took his hand. "I used to steal books from the library," she said. He blinked. "Seriously? Only when they were about places I couldn't afford to visit. Paris, Kyoto, Istanbul. I'd read them under the covers and pretend I was already there." Dorian's gaze held hers. "I want to take you to all of them." She laughed softly. "You barely know me. I know enough to want more." The next morning, she woke up wrapped in one of his shirts, sunlight spilling across her skin. He was in the kitchen, making espresso, barefoot again, humming something under his breath. She stood in the doorway watching him. "I didn't mean to stay over," she said. "I didn't mean for you to leave." He turned, handed her a mug. "You want breakfast?" "I can't. I have to open at the cafe." He frowned. "You work 2 jobs?" "3, technically. The delivery gig, the cafe, and I tutor high school kids on weekends." Dorian set the mug down. "Why?" "Because rent exists. And because my mom's insurance doesn't cover everything." He was quiet for a beat. "You shouldn't have to grind that hard just to survive." She shrugged. "A lot of people do." He didn't argue, just stepped closer and kissed her forehead. "Can I pick you up after work?" Danica hesitated. "I've got a shift until 8. I'll wait." Later that night, when she stepped out of the cafe, he was standing by the curb, leaning against a black car that looked like it belonged in a Bond movie. "You waited. Told you I would." She climbed in. The seats were buttery soft leather, the kind that whispered luxury. He didn't mention it, didn't flaunt it, just drove. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere quiet." They ended up in a private garden behind a townhouse in the West Village, a place he'd bought but never lived in. The garden was overgrown, beautiful in a wild, forgotten way. They sat on a bench under a tangled canopy of vines, sipping tea from a thermos he'd brought. "Why'd you never move in?" she asked. Felt too still. Like it was waiting for something. He looked at her then, and she felt it again, that shift, that gravity. "I think it was waiting for you." Danica looked away, overwhelmed. "You keep saying things like that. Like you already know how this ends." "I don't," he said. "But I know what I want." She didn't answer. Instead, she leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes. And for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like possibility. Danica stood in front of the mirrored wall of the elevator, smoothing the hem of her burgundy blouse, her reflection pale under the soft golden lights. Her fingers toyed with the edge of the envelope in her hand, rent money barely scraped together, waiting to be handed off to her landlord. She should have gone home the moment her shift ended, but Dorian had called her that afternoon and asked if she'd meet him at the Metropolitan Club. He'd said it casually, like it wasn't one of the most exclusive places in the city. Now she was here, staring at her reflection, trying not to look like she was about to bolt. The elevator doors opened to a private floor. Mahogany paneling, velvet drapes, and a curated hush filled the air. A single hostess stood behind a podium, her eyes cool and assessing until she caught sight of Danica's name on the list. Then her expression softened and she motioned toward a set of double doors. Inside, a long table gleamed under a chandelier of dripping crystal. Dorian sat at the head, jacket off, sleeves rolled to his elbows, again not corporate tonight, but commanding in a way that made the room tilt in his direction. He looked up when she entered, and the shift in his expression was instant relief, warmth, and something deeper she wasn't ready to name. "You came," he said, standing. "I almost didn't," she admitted. He pulled out the chair next to him. "Why?" She placed the envelope on the table before sitting. "Because I spent my last 20 on the subway to get here." Dorian didn't reach for the envelope. He didn't even glance at it. "Then I'm glad you did," he said. "Because I have something to ask you." Danica's stomach tightened. "What is it?" He didn't answer at first. Instead, he reached into his coat, draped over the back of the chair, and set a black velvet box on the table. Her pulse stumbled. "Before you panic," he said, "it's not what you think." She stared at the box. "Then what is it?" He opened it slowly. Inside was a silver key, simple, elegant, resting on a bed of velvet. I want you to stay at my place. Danica blinked. What? Just for a while, he said. Until you get your feet under you again. No strings. No expectations. Just space. Safety. She looked at him, wary. Why would you do that? Because I can, he said. And because I want to. That's not a good enough reason. It's the only one that matters. Her fingers curled into her palms. What if I say no? Then you walk out of here and I won't stop you, he said. But I'll still be here. Still wanting to be part of your life. Danica stared at the key. Her first instinct was to reject it to prove she didn't need charity. But something about the way he'd said it without pressure or pity made her hesitate. I don't want to owe you, she whispered. You won't, he said. This isn't a transaction. It's trust. She picked up the key. It was heavier than she expected. If I hate it, I leave. Of course. If this gets weird, I walk. I'd expect nothing less. She slid the key into her pocket. Fine. But I'm not sharing a closet. He laughed. You can have the entire guest wing. The next morning, she stepped into the penthouse with a single duffel bag and a battered backpack. The guest suite was larger than her last 3 apartments combined. The sheets were Egyptian cotton. The bathroom had a rainfall shower and heated floors. There was a note on the bed in Dorian's handwriting. Welcome home. She found him on the balcony, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in a clipped tone that made it clear he wasn't pleased. When he saw her, the line of his shoulders eased. He ended the call and turned toward her. Everything okay? He asked. She nodded. You have more pillows than a department store. Take as many as you want. She folded her arms. I'm not going to turn into some kept woman. I never asked you to. Danica sighed. I just don't want to forget who I am. He walked over, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I wouldn't be doing this if you weren't exactly who you are. That night, they ate takeout on the floor of the living room, surrounded by unopened bookshelves and half-assembled furniture. Danica had insisted on helping him rearrange the space, said it felt too much like a showroom. You know, you're the only person who's ever told me my penthouse is boring, he said, handing her a screwdriver. You're a billionaire and you don't own a toolbox. That's boring. He laughed, genuine and full. You're chaos, and you clearly need it. She looked up to find him watching her again, that same intensity in his eyes. I need something that doesn't come with a quarterly report, he said. Something real. Danica was quiet for a moment. I don't know how to be anyone's something. I'm not asking for anyone, he said. Just you. She leaned over the box of screws, pretending to read the instructions. You're going to regret this. I already regret not doing it sooner. The next week passed in a blur. Mornings started with espresso and quiet glances across the kitchen island. Afternoons, she worked her cafe shifts and dropped by the library to tutor. Evenings, he met her wherever she was, never asking her to change her routine, just folding himself into it like he belonged there. Then Friday came, and with it, her past. She was wiping down tables at the cafe when the door opened and her sister stormed in, cheeks flushed, eyes sharp. Why haven't you answered my calls? Tessa demanded, tossing her phone on the counter. Danica froze. I've been busy. Too busy to tell me you're living with a man who drives a car that costs more than Mom's house? Danica shot a glance at the other barista, who quickly busied herself with espresso. I didn't think it was your business. Tessa crossed her arms. You think I can't tell when you're spiraling? You met this guy, 2 weeks ago? And now you're playing house in the clouds. He's not like that. You don't know what he's like. Danica's voice dropped. Neither do you. Tessa leaned in. I know what happens when you get too close to fire. You burn. And you always drag someone else with you. Danica's hands trembled. This isn't the same. It never is until it is. She didn't have a response. And when Tessa left, slamming the door behind her, Danica stood there, trying not to let the words settle into her bones. That night, Dorian found her on the rooftop, sitting on the ledge, legs dangling over the city. Your sister called me, he said. Danica didn't look at him. Of course she did. She thinks I'm going to break you. She's wrong, Danica whispered. I know. He sat beside her, mirroring her position. She said I burn people, Danica said. That I pull things apart just by being in the room. Dorian was quiet for a long moment. If anything's on fire, it's because I lit the match the second I opened that door. She looked at him then, and for the first time, there was fear in her eyes, not of him, but of herself. I don't know how to want this without ruining it. Then let's ruin it together, he said. And build it again. She didn't respond. But when he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. And that was enough. The ballroom at the Hudson Grand shimmered beneath the weight of 1,000 chandeliers, each one dripping with crystal and casting fragments of light across velvet-draped walls. The air buzzed with strings and whispered named senators, heiresses, tech giants. Danica stood just inside the gilded archway, her heels anchored to the marble floor, her breath caught somewhere in her throat. She hadn't wanted to come, but Dorian had asked her. Not with pressure, not with the expectation of showing her off like some acquisition, but with an invitation laced in something quieter, something closer to hope. Now, standing at the edge of a world she'd never imagined entering, she tried not to flinch when a woman in a floor-length silver gown passed her with a glance that brushed her like frost. "You came," Dorian said behind her, and the room faded. She turned. He looked different tonight, more formal, yes, in a charcoal suit cut with precision, but there was something else. Attention behind his eyes. He hadn't kissed her hello. "I wasn't sure I should," she said. "I wasn't sure I should be here either," he replied. "Then why are we?" He offered his arm. "Because I want them to see you. Not as a mystery. Not as a rumor. As mine." Danica hesitated, then slid her hand into the crook of his arm. "And if I'd said no, I'd have canceled the event. You're not that dramatic. Try me." He guided her into the crowd. The conversations shifted as they passed, polite, polished, but laced with curiosity. She recognized some of the faces from magazines and news segments, others from the back of coffee shop newspapers she used to read on her breaks. Now they all looked at her like she didn't belong. She whispered, "Do they know who I am?" "They'll know tonight." He didn't elaborate, but his grip on her hand was steady. He introduced her to people who nodded, smiled tightly, and asked questions with too much sugar in their tone. "How did you two meet?" Dorian said, "She saved me." Danica blinked. "From what?" He looked at her. "From thinking I had everything." Later, as champagne flutes clinked and the orchestra shifted into something sweeping, a man with a salt and pepper beard approached them. His eyes were sharp, calculating. "Dorian," he said, "you've been avoiding my calls." "I've been busy," Dorian replied evenly. The man's gaze flicked to Danica. "And this must be the girl." Danica straightened. "I have a name." The man's eyebrows rose. "I'm sure you do." Dorian said, "Danica, this is Everett Langston. He sits on the Decker tech board." Danica extended her hand. "I'm not a threat, Mr. Langston. Just a person." He didn't shake it. "People like you don't last in rooms like this." Dorian stepped between them so fast it startled her. "Watch your tone. Your father built this company to stand above scandal," Langston said. "You're dragging it into the tabloids." "I'm not dragging anything. And if you have an issue with my personal life, you can bring it to the next board meeting." Langston narrowed his eyes. "You're risking everything." "She's not a risk. She's the reason I remember what it's all for." Langston left without another word. Danica moved to the edge of the room, her chest tight. Dorian followed her. "I didn't bring you here to prove anything," he said. "I know that," she said quietly. "But now I feel like a test." "You're not." "I'm not ashamed of who I am, Dorian. But I didn't ask for this stage." He looked at her, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. "Then let's walk off it." "What?" "Come with me." He tugged her by the hand, cutting through the crowd, past startled faces and murmurs. They slipped out a side door into a hallway lined with antique mirrors and velvet benches. At the end was another set of doors. He pushed them open. The rooftop garden was empty, the city stretching around them like a sea of stars. The breeze carried the scent of roses and something colder, anticipation. Danica let out a breath. "You just walked out of your own gala." "I don't care. You're not supposed to say that. I've said a lot of things I wasn't supposed to lately." She turned to him. "What's going on?" "I sold the board's voting rights this morning." "What?" "I gave up my controlling share." Her mouth fell open. "Why would you do that?" "Because I was tired of people like Langston thinking they could dictate who I am. What I love. Who I choose. You choose me." "I already did." He pulled something from his pocket. Not a ring. A folded piece of paper. She unfolded it slowly. It was a lease contract. Her name was on it. And so was a bookstore. I bought the space on Mercer, he said. The one you said you used to walk past every day. Why would you? Because you told me you wanted a place of your own. Something that couldn't be taken from you. Something real. She stared at the paper. This is too much. No, he said, stepping closer. This is just enough. Tears burned hot in her eyes. I don't want to be something you saved. You're not, he said. You're the one who saved me. She couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. So she kissed him. And this time it wasn't new or tentative. It was everything they hadn't said. Every fear pushed aside. Every truth laid bare. Later, they sat on a bench in the rooftop's far corner, the city below unaware of the shift that had just taken place. Danica leaned against him. I don't know what happens next. I do, he said. You open your store. I finish what I can without the board breathing down my neck. And every night we come home to the same place. She said nothing for a moment. Then, I want a real bed, not one of those sleek designer ones. Something with too many pillows and a headboard you can lean against. Done. And a dog. A big one or small? Big, but lazy. He smiled. We'll name him something ridiculous. Like Harold. Perfect. They sat in silence, the kind that didn't need filling. Eventually, she said, You know, the first night I met you, I thought, he's too put together. He's going to ruin me. And now I think you ruined me in all the best ways. He pulled her tighter against him. Let's keep ruining each other. A few months later, the glass doors of Nolan's Nook opened to a line that wrapped around the block. Inside the warm, rustic bookstore surrounded by shelves Danica had painted by hand, Dorian stood behind the counter wearing an apron that said, Assistant to the Book Queen. She handed him a clipboard. Inventory check. I'm a CEO, he said. And now you alphabetize. He kissed her temple. Anything for my boss. And in that quiet, perfect moment with laughter in the air and a lazy golden retriever named Harold asleep by the door, Danica finally understood. She hadn't stumbled into someone else's world. She'd built her own. And Dorian had simply chosen to stand beside her in it. Danica tilted her head as the last customer exited Nolan's Nook, the worn brass bell above the door giving a lazy jingle. She flipped the closed sign and leaned against the glass, watching the dusk settle over Mercer Street. The city outside was moving fast as always, but in her little corner of it, the world felt unhurried. Behind her, Dorian struggled to coax Harold off the window display bench. The dog gave a low, lazy groan and didn't move an inch. He's ignoring you again, Danica said, arms crossed. I think he resents me for taking his spot in bed last night, Dorian replied, crouching to scratch the retriever's ears. He has no respect for our relationship boundaries. Danica walked over and plucked a dog treat from the mason jar by the register. You have to bribe loyalty. Everyone knows that. She tossed the biscuit and Harold finally lumbered off the bench, tail wagging like a slow metronome. Dorian straightened and dusted off his hands. I had a meeting with the team this afternoon. You don't have a board anymore, she reminded him. I still have a team. Smaller, better. We're rebuilding Decker Tech under a different division. Leaner. No more quarterly games. No more PR strategy memos about how I should date someone, less pedestrian. Danica raised an eyebrow. Did they really say that? Not in those words. But if I had brought you to that gala last year, they would have written me an apology script by sunrise. And now they ask me what kind of coffee you want before they schedule anything past noon. She laughed and pulled him toward the back room. Come on. We still have to finalize the author event lineup for next month. He followed willingly, but halfway down the hallway he paused and studied her. She was barefoot, her jeans cuffed at the ankle, one hand tangled in her curls as she scanned the printed email list taped to the wall. You know, he said slowly, I've never seen you wear that necklace before. Danica glanced down at the small, antique locket resting against her collarbone. It was my mother's. I found it in a box of old things when I was clearing out the hall closet. She used to wear it when she had job interviews. What's inside? She opened it carefully. Inside, a tiny photo of her and Tessa from childhood, both grinning with gap-toothed smiles and ice cream smeared across their cheeks. Things are better with her, Danica said. We're not perfect, but she came by last week with flowers. And she's been helping me organize the Saturday Kids readings. I'm glad, Dorian said. I think she sees now that I'm not trying to escape the life we had. I just wanted to build something different. He reached out and ran his fingers gently along the chain. And you did. This place is magic. Danica smiled, but there was a quiet look in her eyes. I've been thinking about something. Dangerous words, he teased. She ignored the joke. I want to expand. There's a vacant space 2 buildings down. It's got exposed brick, high ceilings, and enough room for a small event space. We could host community workshops, local art shows, even book clubs. I've been saving, but it'll take time. Dorian didn't hesitate. Let's do it. She shook her head. I'm not asking for you to fund it. I know. I'm offering to invest. As a silent partner. You call every shot. I'll just be your very handsome financial backup. I want this on paper. I'll have the contract drawn up first thing Monday. Danica leaned against the wall. You really don't get tired of supporting me, do you? He stepped closer. You've spent your whole life holding up everyone else. You don't have to carry everything alone anymore. That night, after they closed the shop and walked home under a sky fading into violet, Danica climbed the stairs to the penthouse with her hand in his. When they reached the door, he didn't unlock it. Instead, he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. I've been waiting for the right moment, he said quietly. What moment? He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather case. To do this. Danica's heart stuttered. He opened it slowly. Inside was a ring, simple and stunning. A single oval diamond set on a thin band of brushed gold, delicate but strong. I could say a million things, he said. But the truth is, I knew the second you rang the wrong door that I was going to love you in every lifetime. You are the most unexpected, infuriating, brilliant thing that's ever happened to me. And I want to build 100 bookstores with you. I want Harold to grow old snoring at our feet. I want every morning and every fight and every quiet moment in between. Danica's breath caught. You're serious. I've never been more. He knelt, completely unbothered by the penthouse hallway or the fact that Harold was licking his ear in solidarity. Danica Nolan, will you marry me? She didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, she laughed through the tears that spilled anyway and dropped to her knees in front of him. Yes, she said over and over. Yes, yes, yes. They stayed there a while, tangled in each other, the world outside irrelevant. 3 months later, they stood in the garden behind the old West Village townhouse. The same one where Dorian had first told her he'd been waiting for something to make it feel like home. Now it was strung with lanterns, ivy curling over latticework, and the smell of early summer in the air. Tessa stood beside Danica in a deep green dress, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. On the other side, Dorian's father sat in a wheelchair beneath the shade of a cherry blossom tree, watching with quiet pride. Danica wore a dress she'd found at a vintage shop in Brooklyn a week after they got engaged. It was soft ivory with lace sleeves and a hem that just brushed her ankles. No veil. No tiara. Just her curls pinned loosely and the locket around her neck. Dorian wore a navy suit, his boutonniere a single white gardenia. When the officiant asked if he had any final words before their vows, Dorian took Danica's hands and said, "You were never the wrong door. You were the one that led me home." She whispered, "You were never the fire. You were the match that lit the sky." Later, under strings of golden lights and the sound of laughter and soft jazz, they danced barefoot on the patio, her head resting against his chest, his arms holding her like he never planned to let go. The city breathed around them, alive and indifferent, but in that garden, time folded in. They didn't need a castle or a palace. Just a small bookstore, a big dog, and a love that had rewritten everything they thought they knew. And when Dorian whispered, "forever," against her ear, Danica already knew. They were already there.